So welcome to our next podcast. I think this one's going to be interesting because Naveen brought up a topic, so I'll let him introduce it.
Yeah, this is trying to broaden out a little bit from our, fixation on AI and just talk about technology in general. And the main topic that I'd like to get into is the responsibility of ethics to technologists, meaning, the concept of right and wrong. How much are we responsible for that as people who design products, research products, those types of things? Right?
Okay, so what's your perspective? How much are you responsible?
So I think this is just me as a person. I tend to think of things almost as black and white. Like I think that's just really how I walk through the world, and things are good or things are evil, right? And I'm trying to be better at that and see the gray and all of that, but that applies to everything I do. And so I take responsibility for the things that I make, and I think that I choose not to make things that I think could cause harm. That's a personal choice.
And if your employer asks you to do something, right, that you believe crosses a legal or ethical boundary, because I think this is what people are wondering about in AI today. I know you're trying to keep it broad, but
we'll obviously get there, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So what do you do in that situation?
I think I'll tell you a story, I guess, is a way of explaining that. So I as we kind of talked about before, I've been in the academic community. So I did my PhD, and in that world, you are, you need funding to be able to do the work that you're doing. And I remember something that I ran into at that time, which was moats. I don't know if anybody remembers computing moats. So the idea was like you could build these little tiny computing dots and throw them into clouds and understand hurricanes and things like that. And I remember seeing a lab of the team that was working on this, and their moat research, while they would publicly kind of talk about hurricanes and weather and so on, was a table with little hills and fake trees and little like G.I. Joes and tanks. And it was like, what in the world? And then you go look at their funding, and it's DARPA. It's like, okay, well, who's funding this thing, right? And for me, that led to a decision of mine, which is I didn't want to knowingly, and now someone's going to probably correct me and be like, you did actually work under DARPA funding once upon a time. But I've always chosen that, hey, given the choice, I want to not be funded under those things. And I think that's a long-winded way of answering your question, which is that if I'm asked to do something that I find unethical, it's my choice that I can quit and go work somewhere else.
But let's dig into that word ethical, right? Because as humans, we all have a certain level of baseline of morality, ethics, etc. And right now, it's when you're a child, it's like there's a binary line between lying is good and evil. Like it's fairly binary. And as you become an adult, you learn about a white lie. Like if you're, this is the trolley problem in physics of like, okay, there's what's the lesser of two evils? Like it becomes relative.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, the trolley problem, by the way, isn't that the one where if you go one direction, you kill like 3 people, but if you go the other direction, you kill a child or something like that, right? And it's like, well, which one do you choose, right? Yeah. They're both bad options.
Yeah, well, there's both bad options. And, like it first starts with 3 and 1, and then it goes to what if the one's a child? And what if the one's a pregnant woman and they're like you can make it infinitely more complicated, right? And that's a lot of the research on philosophy is relative morality versus absolute morality, right? As we become, but part of that is a factor of time because when you're doing something, especially on the advent of AI now, right? If you look at dystopian things, sometimes the creator at a certain baseline doesn't know what it'll turn into in the future.
True.
Right?
Absolutely
so
true.
You might be doing something from an intentional place of good. You're like, I'm not doing evil. I believe this AI thing I'm building isn't going to turn into our overlord that's going to destroy society.
100%.
Right? So let's assume for a second you do that. What if there's another person with a better longitudinal outlook that thinks about the world longitudinally and isn't thinking about solving the AI problem now and the good you could get out of it, but they see the bad and you don't see the bad.
Yep.
Do you have an ethical moral responsibility for things you're not smart enough to see?
No, I think I'm not, that's fair, right? So
Yeah.
I'm definitely not saying that we have to be prescient in any way, right? There's things we don't know. But on the other hand, I do think we should be challenging ourselves. So going back to, again, like more like physics, right? You could talk about laser research, right? And lasers do a lot of things. There are a class, and by the way, I also want to be clear that I'm not like hard against, I understand there's a purpose for, like, we do fight. There are wars. There are weapons. Like I'm going to come across as sounding like I'm a pacifist. Like I prefer not to do those things. I understand why they're there. I have a personal choice as to whether or not I want to have created those things. And I think that there's a lot of technologists, I'll claim, that if they did know what they were building, they might choose differently, right? And so I think lasers are one of those things where they have lots of applications. You can use it for surgery. You can use it for measuring things. You can use them for blowing things up, right? And I do think there's a time where you start realizing, like, this is a really high power laser. I don't know what human you're going to do surgery on, but I'm not sure they're going to be there anymore. It's like, all right, you could probably ask the question, well, what am I doing? What am I building? Like, what are the possible applications for this? Because the window of possibilities is narrowing.
It narrows.
Right.
Like, that's a micro thing, but I'm going to give you an example in, something that I saw in the past, right? I saw a pattern in the Oppenheimer movie about, he created the atom bomb.
Right.
And at the time of creation, he was talking to Einstein and others who were like, be careful what you do. They had a different neurodivergent pattern around how they viewed it. And he's like, look, this is just a technology.
Right.
And I'm just proving that it can be done. And yes, it's in the government application of doing this thing, but I will also advocate that if I don't do it, someone else will.
Right.
So by doing it, right, this is the arms race argument in ethics and morality.
Yep.
Is it more ethically moral for me to do it and try to safeguard it and control it than not to do it?
Yeah, and I think that's a valid question. And I guess where I stand on that is at least the debate was being had. And I think that's, and we can come back to like that debate, but I think where I draw the line is I do, and maybe this is my perception, I get the feeling that there are many technologists and many computer scientists, many scientists anyway, involved who will say, that's not my domain. My domain is literally to just think about the science, the technology, and what can be created. And this debate that you're trying to have with me about ethics, like, who am I to say, right? And I guess where I'm drawing the line is, you absolutely, I believe you are obligated to participate in that debate. And the reason is that you might be the only person who really understands the thing that you were building, and possibly the good applications as well as the bad, right? And so I'm not suggesting that you have a moral obligation to only do good. I'm just suggesting that I don't think you can abdicate
responsibility for
right.
you.
So that's kind of like the first half of my discussion.
And I'm actually probably not there with you on that.
Really?
Right? So yeah, what's interesting is, because I try to break down problems into either psychological or sociological. Psychological is your personal view, and sociological is the view of many. Right? So in the case of psychological, what's mostly driving scientific achievement from a psychological view, when you're doing a breakthrough thing, you're not competing against others. You are in a cohort of one. You're the genius that is only capable of doing the thing.
Sure.
Right? You see the world in a way no one else does, and you're in a cohort of one. So what drives that persona, that psychology of that individual, is pride, ego, and accomplishment. It's, I need to prove that it can be done. Because it's not easy. It requires the force of will to go where no man has gone before. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, it requires that from a psychological standpoint. And it's not that they may not want to be ethical or moral, but it comes from an extreme narrow focus of scientific achievement to prove the theory, make it practical, do the thing, achieve.
Yeah.
Now, anyone who's proceeded down that path, the moment they hit the achievement, and they saw the output of the achievement has regretted it. So like if I look at the statistical pattern of Dr. Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein,
Right.
it was driven to extreme accomplishments to build the first AI, which was Frankenstein, right? And then he's like, what have I unleashed? And then like the same thing if you follow with Oppenheimer, right? He did and Einstein was there to tell him like, don't do it, be careful. Like, but he was driven not because he thought Einstein was wrong, not because he was self-rationalizing ethics and morality, being like, it's better that I do it.
Yeah.
But I think that's a rationalization. I think what drove him was the need to achieve. And like, I understand, like I can associate like breaking barriers, thinking about invention, thinking about like the achievement economics of like, but I need to do it because I can. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's the id. Now, why was Einstein different? Right? And I would argue that one pathway is that straight line psychological drive, which creates less neurodiversity. Meaning you've studied and become the foremost expert in particle physics.
Yep.
And you stay narrow. Einstein was multidisciplinary. So the more neurodivergence you have from a domain space, when you're on the path to achieve, you step back and can take the more short-term neurodivergent you are, the more long-term you can understand the long-term ethical more ramifications as you're building.
That's
right.
Yep.
So the reason why I wasn't in your in the same camp of I have an absolute ethical and moral responsibility, I'm like, who am I? Like, do I even know? You know what I mean? So I try to strive for more neurodiversity now, so I can try to think through longevity of ethics and morality. Because right now, I would argue for most things when you're creating, if you've got a singular focus on achievement, in a world that is gray and there's no absolute right and wrong,
yep,
you're statistically probable or improbable to get the ethics and morality right.
I'll give you that. So I think I see your point. I think you're saying that I don't agree. Maybe I can explain more the nuance of why I don't agree. But
yeah.
I think your point is that, okay, well, what is the growth of knowledge, the growth of technology, growth of science? You know, the way I always think of it is it's almost like a frontier. There's like the surface of, you know, human achievement, human knowledge, and there's these individuals who they've kind of picked their part of the frontier and they're going to move it a little bit forward, right? And it's probably like a small group of people. I don't think it's generally one, but it's, you know, there's a small group, I'll give you that, right? Mm-hmm. And they're hyper focused on that really specific thing because, I mean, let's be honest, the things we know as a species is so vast that if you're going to move any part of that frontier forward, like you better know that part super, super well. You might have no knowledge whatsoever about poetry, right? Mm-hmm. Or whatever, right? So I think that's true. And there's that singular focus, and that's what allows you to push it forward. I think that is true for some time, but then let's say you do move it forward. Part of any sort of knowledge taking hold is getting it into sort of the community, right? Like that you build consensus, other people start saying things.
But that's where companies come in.
Well, I mean, and maybe even before companies, but maybe with companies, right?
Yeah.
Inclusive of companies, but it can be just individuals as well. That neurodivergence comes in just because the knowledge is spreading. And the thing that I find interesting is that...
you think at that point people are in denial?
I think, yes, I do. And here's why. And I think it's because, and it actually came up, it comes up in kind of the you know, AI is going on right now and people are asking these questions again, right? And actually, to maybe the counterpoint to me is people are asking these ethical questions, right? But there's the response people are having is, well, sometimes I see, well, that's up for the government to decide what to do. And what I'll claim is they're in their own frontier, right? Government and, you know, how societies operate, like it's a whole nother frontier of how things work. And they have like zero understanding of what this thing is. So an average senator, my guess is if you'd say, hey, what do you think about, you know, AI that's going on right now, blah, blah, blah. And like maybe they've seen movies, like
Yeah.
their knowledge
look,
is zero.
I
right?
think we've seen the congressional testimony of when they had Zuckerberg there and the questions that were being asked.
Exactly.
Right.
So they're not equipped, right?
But maybe, right? So, like, I think I'm going to refer back to one of our earlier podcasts where I brought up this thesis of disaggregated responsibility between the social, public, and private sector.
Yep. It's kind of getting back to that, right?
Right. We're getting back to that because would I prefer an integrated view where the individual takes responsibility across multidisciplines of both social, what is ethically moral, public, which is governance and policy, and private, which is capitalism and applicability of technology. Like, I think centralizing that is better than distributing that, especially in the context of creation, right? So I generally agree with you that, okay, that's good. That is not what is societal norms. And if you actually look at Western law, you know what's legal is what are socially accepted norms. In Western law, it's all about precedent. It's not like there's a difference between parliamentary law in England and like American like case law. In American case law, what's legal is just what people believe are socially accepted norms. That's why it's the jury of the peers,
Actually,
right?
I never thought about
So there is no, like, what's legal is not constitutionally defined as absolute. It's defined as relatively what we accept as a society right now. It's like trying to go back in time and prosecute slave owners for slavery. At the time, it was accepted.
That's right.
I think it's a horrible practice.
Right.
Right? But at the time, that was a socially accepted norm. Right? So imagine the future. Our great-great-grandkids are looking back at us, like watching this podcast.
Right.
Right? And they're like, you guys are flipping idiots.
Of course they will.
Because they're going to be living in a world where like all these prophecies we're making about AI are so short-sighted, and they're going to see the world from a different set of socially accepted norms, right? So how do you, like my issue with ethics and morality is when you're like, because there's engineering where I'm like, okay, great, I'll code the thing someone told me, but there's invention.
Yep.
When you're on, because I think the argument we're having is frontier engineering.
Yes.
Right? On frontier engineering, like what makes me capable, like more than the senator? Like I would say the incompetent senator that doesn't understand the thing you're building might have a reasonably better chance under current circumstances of setting a policy.
Well, so okay, I'm going to use another movie as sort of a talking point or a reference. Do you remember the movie War Games?
Yeah.
And so there's the doctor who creates the computer that can play all of these games, including like chess and checkers, and it gets really good at it. And then one of the games it learns is thermonuclear war. It's like trying to model, thermonuclear war between two superpowers, right? And so in the movie, it gets connected by the government. Essentially, that system, which was really just learning how to play games, gets connected to manage our missile defense system. It's like they create this thing called Whopper. It's really funny, whatever. It's all dark comedy, right? Yeah. But I think that's an example of this is sort of frontier technology that's now being applied in a way that you should be scared, right? Because I'll qualify that by saying the person who did that, because in the movie they're basically saying humans are less likely to like pull the trigger and launch a missile when needed, because there's situations where mutually assured destruction, you want to make that a real threat, otherwise it has no value. Humans don't make it a real threat, so let's put a computer in the place, and it has no emotions. It will fire when it's appropriate to. The problem is that the person who makes that decision to connect this computer into a role that a human normally plays doesn't understand the problems the computer has, right? It's like, okay, humans don't perform the way I want to, and this thing seems to perform perfectly. But I think technologists understand, but it actually doesn't. It has its own flaws. And so coming back to AI, again, which I know I said I didn't want to, one of the things that I'm seeing is people are trying to get into, okay, well, should an AI take action? And you look at what these AIs can do, and you're like, yeah, totally. I want it to just do what it thinks is right. But those of us who actually understood what's going on and be like, but a couple percent of the time it's going to like hallucinate.
Well, so, okay. I'm going to push you on this, right? So we're going down a different path now. The definition pre-AI of digital transformation was a combination of IT and OT data. And IT data is like, okay, here are my financial records and my transactional data and whatever. And OT data was your telemetry data, operational telemetry, right?
Okay.
And those things were used to combine things to make for decision making, right? Like legacy pre-AI decision making was there, right? And largely people are training things on like either operational data or IT data, right? Or unstructured data, like that came into the mix, like Wikipedia and documents, right?
Right.
But what if there's a future where, and you see this more in the AdSense world, of human telemetry, meaning my training data is monitoring the humans. And like we discussed this in our Valentine's Day episode of like, hey, if this is the way I write, it can look back at the way I write and be me. So that's a superior version of me. Now you bring that together in your war games analogy, right? Yes, humans would hesitate. But if we evolve the data training to use human telemetry, is there a point in the future where you would be like, war games is okay?
So it's interesting. That reminds me of another book. So Kurt Vonnegut, who I love, he wrote a book called Player Piano.
Oh, yeah.
And what the premise of that one is basically, I think getting to this point, it's like saying, okay, you can have an automated piano that plays music, but it never really sounds as good as a human, right? And so the premise there was for pianos and machines and everywhere where there was skilled labor, what they did was they basically modeled the perfect person who's perfect at doing this thing, so playing the piano, for example, and then built the system so that it plays like they do. And it's literally as good as they are. So all you're really doing is taking like a human and maybe making it a little better, and you're just doing what the human would do. And I think that's what you're kind of getting at.
But again, we all as humans were fallible, right?
Right.
So
do it across many humans and so on.
So you
right?
minimize fallacy, right? Like that's what we were doing with IT and OT data, statistics.
Totally, 100%. And I think that's probably true, but or maybe okay, but I think it's still, coming back to the concept of ethics and so on. It's like we're now we're just like, in this case, I get to the ethical concern of like replacing a human, right? Which is maybe a separate topic all in and of itself. But I'm not trying to claim that technology is always fallible. Like that's not really where I'm going with that.
Yeah.
So the war
you're looking at it from an individual view of what's my ethical and moral.
Exactly, like understanding. So I'd say maybe my counterpoint is maybe you're already responding to my concern, right? You're saying like, okay, yeah, there could be a problem. So let's maybe figure out how to make it less of a problem, right? And I think you get there because you're concerned about outcome.
Yeah.
And
so your argument is everyone should consider or think logically about the implications of what they build.
Yes. And I do think that's a responsibility.
So you'd say in the job description, you as an individual are responsible for thinking in your context of what is ethically and morally responsible.
I actually liked where you're going with the idea of law and social norms.
Yeah.
I think maybe really what I'm trying to say is I wonder if we as an industry in the Bay Area maybe have created a social norm that we are not responsible for these things.
I think that's true.
And maybe that's really where I'm
And look, I tend to agree with you, right? I do think that as an individual, the reason I was pushing the longevity argument, right, was I do think I have an ethical, moral responsibility for what I put into the world. I do.
You do, yeah.
Right? But I am concerned that I'm not going to meet my ethical and moral standard, right? And the reason why I was pushing the neurodiversity and the longevity argument is how do I improve my ethical, moral standard?
Yeah.
Right? And I think if I was to chart, on a chart, the more narrow and the more focused I get on an achievement, the there are compensating factors that will make me less ethical and moral with a direct increase in focus and narrow. And the more distributed my focus is across neurodivergent domains, the higher my ethical, moral, and standard will be well into the future, right? I wonder if there's a formula and a chart you could build that projects time value of ethical, moral standards based on work input output. You know?
Walk me through that a little bit. So
like, if you think about the variables of the equation, right? You're like, okay, one, how focused and how much energy are you putting in?
Okay.
What's your energy dispersion across focus domains? Because then energy dispersion will mean less distance of energy because you're dispersing it across.
You're spreading yourself thin.
And as you spread the more you're spread in different divergent domains, at the same time, your ethic morality standards based on norms will increase their time value, right? Future options trading, right? Of how long. So like, let's say your view based on how you operate might be what decisions you make will stand the test of time for 50 years or 100 years in ethics and morality.
Okay.
Right? And maybe someone else is at 25 and maybe someone's at 200. And you can directly measure that based on neurodivergent domains.
Interesting.
Right? Overall. So I don't know if there's a way. Like, these are longitudinal behavior studies.
That's a fascinating discussion.
Right? It's a sociology discussion.
Actually, it's one of those things. And a lot of people hear this right now. I hear this all the time. So I think there's a... bear with me for a second. There's sometimes people have a pushback on STEM focused education, right? And it's because, okay, well, STEM is science, technology,
engineering,
math. Yeah. And it's like, okay, you're learning how to do all of these things that are really about the knowledge of how the world works, how do you build things, how do you operate things, does that mean by definition that you're not learning, about history or art or all of these other things, right? And so I think anecdotally, I would claim that your thesis might be true, because I'll claim that if you teach someone STEM and history, STEM and literature, they are more likely to build something that is probably useful, and B, going to be more resilient to some of these future-looking concerns, right? Because they have a knowledge of the past, they have the knowledge of what are we trying to do as a species, those types of things, right? So I think we see it just in education in general.
Yeah. There was a period where STEM tried to become STEAM with arts, right? Yeah. Like, I remember that, and it faded away.
I feel like that was that always felt like a shout out to art, right? We're getting 4 letters to the math things and the science things, but 1. And so I think you're probably right that the more you have to think broadly.
But would that minimize frontier? Like, the more broad you go, because you don't have the focus and the energy, are you killing frontiers? Are you slowing down society because of ethical and moral concerns?
But by the way, baked into your question is that speed is good.
Capitalist general manager architect.
Exactly.
Right? Speed and delivery.
Exactly. And I mean,
guilty as charged.
That is a fundamental question we have to answer, right? Is it always better to go faster, right? And because I liked where you were going, and I was like, oh, this might be a great answer for slow down, right? This is why you want to slow down. You are going to make better things, right? So anyway,
yeah,
I think it's a tricky topic. But I guess for me anyway, what I would like to see is maybe just a change in the bay of, hey, we accept this as a social norm, and maybe that's really what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think that's right. I could agree that we as individuals need to create a social norm that we are responsible. And if our employer disagrees, instead of whistleblowing, use your skills, go elsewhere, right? This is not about a whistleblower thing.
Exactly.
This is like, you can opt in and opt out. Like, we're at will employment. Yep. This is not indentured servitude. If we were talking about slavery, it would be a different problem.
Exactly.
Right? So go to places that align to your culture, your moral, and your values, and relatively can you accept that we should all strive to increase our ethical and moral standards with longevity over time.
Yeah, yeah. And I think if we make those decisions, I think there will just be better outcomes.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I'd go. But
so I think, that's good discussion this week, but I think you've definitely given me some things to think about, so thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's a wrap.
That's all right.